The champagne flute slipped from my fingers with a crystalline ting against the marble floor of Le Bernardin, the sound cutting through the ambient murmur of anniversary conversations and clinking silverware. Marcus didn't even look up from his phone. He was texting her again, Sophia from his investment firm right there at our table, with the orchid centerpiece I'd specifically requested, and the wine I'd saved 3 months to afford. "The Armagnac tasting is about to start," I said quietly, watching the golden liquid seep into the white tablecloth like a stain I couldn't take back. His thumb moved across the screen with mechanical indifference. "Actually, babe, I need to cut this short. Sophia's having a crisis with the Morrison account and—" "It's our 5-year anniversary." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with the weight of every canceled dinner, every interrupted conversation, every time he'd chosen her crisis over my presence. Marcus finally looked up, his blue eyes holding that familiar flash of irritation, the same look he'd given me when I'd asked him to come to my mother's funeral last year instead of Sophia's birthday party. "Emma, you know how important this deal is. Sophia needs you." The clarity hit me with the force of a physical blow, sudden and absolute. "She always needs you." He set down his phone with a sigh that somehow made me feel like I was the unreasonable one. "It's not like that. She's my colleague. This is work." But I was done listening to explanations that explained nothing and excuses that excused everything except his choices. I was done being the understanding girlfriend, the flexible one, the one who rearranged her life around his priorities while he texted another woman at our anniversary dinner. I stood up from the table, my black dress, the one I'd bought specifically for tonight, suddenly feeling like costume armor I no longer needed to wear. "Where are you going?" "Home." The word tasted strange on my tongue. Soon it wouldn't mean anything at all. The thing about systematic emotional neglect is that it doesn't announce itself with dramatic gestures or obvious cruelty. It arrives quietly, in small increments, like water slowly filling a basement until one day you realize you're drowning and can't remember when you last had dry feet. Marcus and I had met 6 years ago at a gallery opening in Soho. He was charming then, attentive in the way that made me feel like I was the only person in the room. He brought me coffee in the mornings, remembered that I hated cilantro, listened to my rambling stories about my job at the Metropolitan Museum's conservation department with what seemed like genuine interest. "You're brilliant," he'd tell me, tracing patterns on my bare shoulder as we lay in his king-sized bed in the Tribeca loft his family money had purchased. "The way you see art, the way you understand those old master-sits, like you can read their souls." I'd believed him then. I'd believed a lot of things. The shift began gradually, imperceptibly, like watching the seasons change. First, it was just occasional work emergencies that pulled him away from our dates. "You understand, right? This client is crucial for my career." And I did understand. I prided myself on being understanding. Then Sophia joined his firm. Sophia Chen, Harvard, MBA, Silicon Valley pedigree, a smile that belonged in toothpaste commercials, and a mind that could apparently solve any crisis Marcus's other colleagues couldn't handle. She was brilliant, he assured me. Brilliant and dedicated and absolutely essential to the success of every major deal his company pursued. "She's just a colleague," he'd say whenever I expressed the faintest concern about their increasingly frequent dinners, weekend strategy sessions, and late-night phone calls that lasted until 2 a.m. "You're being paranoid." But paranoia suggests irrational fear, and there was nothing irrational about watching your boyfriend's face light up when another woman's name appeared on his phone screen. There was nothing irrational about noticing that he remembered every detail of Sophia's complicated family dynamics while forgetting that my grandmother had died the week before. Over the course of 3 years, I watched myself shrink. Not physically, though. I did lose weight from the constant knot of anxiety in my stomach, but emotionally. I became smaller, quieter, more accommodating. I learned to swallow my disappointment when he canceled our weekend plans for Sophia's emergency presentation. I learned to smile when he spent our date nights recounting, in vivid detail, how brilliant Sophia had been in that morning's client meeting. I learned to compete for attention with a ghost who somehow always won. The house in Westchester had been my idea. "Let's build something together," I'd suggested during one of our rare uninterrupted evenings. "A place that's ours." Marcus had agreed with the distracted enthusiasm he showed toward most of my proposal shelf listening, already mentally composing his next text to Sophia. But I'd thrown myself into the project with the desperate energy of someone trying to create a foundation that couldn't be shaken. I'd spent months researching architects, poring over blueprints, selecting every fixture, and finished with the meticulous care I brought to restoring 15th century paintings. The house became my love letter to a relationship I was trying desperately to save: cathedral ceilings that would showcase the art collection we'd build together, a kitchen designed for the dinner parties we'd host, a study where Marcus could work in peace. The irony wasn't lost on me that he'd done most of that work from Sophia's apartment. I'd furnished our dream house with antiques I'd found at estate sales, artwork I'd acquired through my museum connections, first edition books Marcus claimed to love but never read. Every room told the story of the life I'd imagined we'd share, the life I'd been auditioning for, unknowingly, for years. But as the house grew more beautiful, our relationship grew more hollow. Marcus spent less and less time there, claiming his commute was too long, the Wi-Fi too unreliable for his important calls with Sophia. He'd arrive late on Friday nights, exhausted from his week of crisis management, only to spend Saturday and Sunday fielding her urgent texts about deals that couldn't wait until Monday. "She's going through a divorce," he'd explain when I questioned why a professional colleague needed emotional support at 11 p.m. on a Sunday. "She needs someone to talk to." "What about me?" I'd ask, hating how small my voice sounded. "I need someone to talk to sometimes, too." "It's different," he'd say, not explaining how. The worst part wasn't the canceled plans or the interrupted conversations or even the increasingly infrequent physical intimacy that felt more like an obligation than a connection. The worst part was the way he made me feel crazy for noticing what was happening right in front of me. "You're being insecure," he'd tell me when I pointed out that he spent more time talking to Sophia than to me. "You're imagining things." But I wasn't imagining the way he smiled at his phone when she texted. I wasn't imagining the secret jokes they shared or the way he'd light up when recounting their conversations. I wasn't imagining that he'd forgotten my birthday, but remembered Sophia's favorite type of wine. I began documenting things, almost unconsciously, not to build a case against him, but to preserve my own sanity. I wrote down the dates he canceled our plans for Sophia's emergencies. I noted the times he'd left our bed to take her late-night calls. I tracked the progression from colleague to close friend, to someone who really understands the pressure I'm under at work. By year 4, I felt like a ghost haunting my own relationship. The therapy suggestion had been mine, presented during one of our increasingly rare heart-to-heart conversations. "I think we should talk to someone," I'd said carefully, having rehearsed the words for weeks. "About communication, about priorities." Marcus had agreed with the same distracted tolerance he showed most of my requests, and we'd spent 6 months in Dr. Patricia Coleman's office, sitting on opposite ends of an expensive beige couch while I tried to articulate feelings that seemed to evaporate the moment Marcus offered his calm, rational explanations. "Emma has always been prone to overthinking," he'd tell Dr. Coleman with the patient tone of someone describing a beloved pet's quirks. "She reads too much into normal work relationships." I'd watch Dr. Coleman's face during these sessions, searching for some sign that she could see what I was seeing: the subtle dismissals. The way he redirected every conversation about our relationship back to his professional obligations, the complete absence of accountability for his choices. But Marcus was skilled at presenting himself as the reasonable one, the one who was trying to balance a demanding career with a high-maintenance girlfriend who didn't understand the pressures of his world. "Have you considered that perhaps your expectations are unrealistic, Doctor?" Coleman had asked me during one particularly frustrating session. Modern relationships require flexibility and understanding. I'd left that appointment feeling more lost than when I'd arrived. Maybe I was the problem. Maybe I was asking too much. Maybe this was what adult relationships looked like, and I was the naive one for expecting something different. But deep down, beneath all the gaslighting and self-doubt, some small voice kept whispering the truth I was afraid to acknowledge. This wasn't love. This was endurance. The 5-year anniversary dinner had been my last attempt to resurrect something that had been slowly dying for years. I'd made reservations at Le Bernardin 3 months in advance, bought a dress that made me feel beautiful, arranged for roses to be delivered to our table. I'd even written him a letter 5 pages of careful, vulnerable words about the future I still hoped we could build together. The letter was still in my purse, unread, when I watched him choose Sophia over me for the last time. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in the living room of our Westchester house, surrounded by the life I'd so carefully curated, and felt the last threads of denial finally snap. The clarity was sharp and clean. like the first breath after surfacing from deep water. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't asking too much. I wasn't imagining the distance between us or the emotional affair that had been happening in plain sight for 3 years. Marcus loved Sophia. Maybe he couldn't admit it to himself yet. Maybe he genuinely believed their relationship was purely professional. But the evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. And God, how had it taken me so long to see it? I deserved better than competing for scraps of attention from someone who saw me as an obligation rather than a choice. The house was in my Nama detail Marcus had suggested for tax reasons, given his family's complicated financial trust structure. At the time, I'd felt honored by his confidence in our future together. Now, I felt grateful for the protection it offered. I spent the morning researching real estate attorneys, my laptop screen glowing in the pre-dawn darkness as Marcus slept upstairs, probably dreaming of someone else. By 9 a.m., I had 3 consultations scheduled. The plan formed itself with startling clarity, as if it had been waiting in the back of my mind for years, fully developed and ready for implementation. I would sell the house quietly, quickly, before Marcus realized what was happening. I would cash out my investments, transfer my retirement accounts, and disappear from his life as efficiently as he'd been erasing me from his. But I wouldn't just leave. I would go somewhere beautiful, somewhere that matched the life I actually wanted instead of the one I'd been settling for. I would go to Paris. The idea wasn't random, it was the culmination of a dream I'd been suppressing for years. During my graduate studies in art history, I'd spent a semester at the Sorbonne, working with manuscripts at the Bibliothèque Nationale and falling in love with a city that seemed to understand beauty in a way that matched my soul. Someday, I'd told Marcus early in our relationship, I'd love to spend a year in Paris, maybe work at the Louvre or the Musée d'Orsay. He'd responded, not looking up from his laptop. That would be difficult with my career trajectory. I'd filed the dream away with all the other desires that didn't fit into Marcus's 5-year plan. But now, sitting in a house that had become more prison than home, I pulled that dream back out and held it up to the light. Why not Paris? I had marketable skills, museum connections, enough French to navigate the transition. I had enough money from the house sale to buy myself time to establish a new life. Most importantly, I had nothing left to lose except a relationship that had been over for years. The real estate attorney, Patricia Henning, was a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who listened to my situation with the practiced neutrality of someone who'd heard similar stories before. "You want to sell quickly and quietly," she summarized, reviewing the documents I'd brought. "That's certainly possible, given that the property is solely in your name. What's your timeline?" "As fast as legally possible." She nodded. "I can have the paperwork ready for you to sign by Friday. With the current market conditions, I'd estimate 2 to 3 weeks for a sale, assuming you're willing to price competitively." 2 to 3 weeks, less than a month to dismantle 5 years of shared life and step into a future that was entirely my own. "There's one more thing," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice. "I need this to be confidential. My partner doesn't know I'm selling yet." Patricia's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes softened with understanding. "That's not uncommon in these situations. We can structure the sale to maintain privacy until closing." I walked out of her office feeling lighter than I had in years. The next 2 weeks passed in a surreal haze of secret efficiency. While Marcus continued his routine of early morning departures for breakfast meetings with Sophia and late-night strategy sessions that kept him at her apartment until the small hours, I systematically dismantled the life we'd built together. I started with the practical matters, quietly removing my name from joint accounts, changing my emergency contacts from Marcus to my sister Claire, researching French visa requirements and apartment rentals in the 5th arrondissement. The house sold faster than Patricia had predicted. A young couple from Manhattan, both investment bankers, fell in love with the cathedral ceilings and the chef's kitchen I designed for dinner parties that never happened. They offered asking price and wanted to close within 2 weeks. "It's perfect," the woman had gushed during the showing, running her manicured fingers along the marble countertops I'd spent months selecting. "We could host amazing parties here." I'd smiled and nodded, remembering the fantasy I'd once shared of filling these rooms with laughter and conversation. Now I could only hope they'd have better luck with their dreams than I'd had with mine. Hacking was more emotional than I'd expected. Each room held artifacts of the person I'd been, the hopes I'd harbored, the compromises I'd made, the art collection we'd never built together, the library of books Marcus never read, the bedroom furniture that had witnessed the slow death of intimacy. I kept only what mattered: my professional portfolio, my grandmother's jewelry, a few pieces of art that held personal meaning, and the extensive collection of documents that proved my life existed independently of Marcus Whitfield. The rest, the furniture, the dishes, the decorative objects that had once seemed so important, I left for Marcus to deal with. A parting gift that would force him to confront the reality of what he'd lost through his own choices. My resignation from the Met was the hardest conversation. Dr. Margaret Eisenstein, the department head who'd become a mentor over my 7 years there, listened with concern as I explained my decision. "This seems very sudden, Emma. Is everything all right?" "I'm moving to Paris," I said, the words still feeling like a foreign language on my tongue. "There's an opportunity at the Musée Rodin that I can't pass up." It wasn't entirely a lie. I'd reached out to contacts from my graduate program and learned about a temporary position that could become permanent for the right candidate. My reputation and experience made me competitive, and the timing was perfect. "I'm happy for you, Dr. Eisenstein said, though her expression remained concerned. "But are you sure you're making this decision for the right reasons? Running away from personal problems rarely?" "I'm not running away," I interrupted, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. "I'm running toward something." The distinction mattered more than I could explain. Marcus barely noticed my efficient packing, the steady disappearance of my belongings, or my sudden interest in organizing our shared spaces. He was too busy managing Sophia's latest crisis, something about a client threatening to pull a multi-million-dollar account, to pay attention to the systematic erasure of my presence from his life. "You're being very productive lately," he'd commented one evening, glancing up from his phone long enough to notice the half-empty bookshelves. "Spring cleaning?" I'd replied, sealing another box of memories I'd never look at again. The most difficult part was maintaining normalcy while internally preparing for a conversation that would change everything. I cooked his favorite meals, laughed at his distracted attempts at humor, listened to his increasingly detailed updates about Sophia's professional and personal dramas. "She's really struggling with the divorce," he'd tell me over dinner, his voice full of compassion he'd never shown for my struggles. "Her ex-husband is being vindictive about the settlement." "That must be hard for her," I'd respond, marveling at my ability to sound sympathetic while planning my exit from his life. The final week brought an unexpected gift. Marcus announced he'd be spending the weekend at a company retreat in the Hamptons. "Team-building exercises," he'd explained. "Sophia organized the whole thing." Of course she had. With Marcus safely out of the way, I completed the last practical steps of my escape plan. I hired a moving company to pack and ship my remaining belongings to a storage facility in Paris. I transferred the proceeds from the house sale to a French bank account I'd opened through my grandfather's old contacts in international finance. I booked a one-way flight to Charles de Gaulle, departing Tuesday morning. By Sunday evening, the house was empty except for Marcus's belongings and a few pieces of furniture too large to move quickly. I spent my last night there sitting on the floor of what had been our bedroom, surrounded by the echoes of a relationship that had ended long before I'd found the courage to admit it. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Running late, don't wait up. Important breakthrough with Morrison account." I turned off the phone without responding. There was nothing left to say. Monday morning arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of weather that matched the ending of things. I stood in the empty kitchen of our former home, drinking coffee from a paper cup and waiting for Marcus to return from his weekend of team building with Sophia. He arrived at 10:30 a.m., looking rumpled and distracted, his usual state after extended time in Sophia's orbit. It took him a full 30 seconds to register that something was wrong. "Where's everything?" He stood in the doorway, his expensive weekend bag dropping from his shoulder as he took in the bare walls, the missing furniture, the complete absence of every trace of my existence. "I sold the house," I said simply. "The new owners take possession tomorrow." Marcus's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, anger before settling on the condescending patience he'd perfected over our years together. "Very funny, Emma. Where did you put everything? Is this some kind of anniversary surprise to make up for last week?" "I'm moving to Paris." I watched his face carefully, looking for some sign that this news caused him genuine distress rather than mere inconvenience. "I leave tomorrow morning." "You can't be serious." He pulled out his phone. presumably to text Sophia about this latest crisis requiring her brilliant problem-solving skills. We can talk about this rationally. If you're upset about the anniversary dinner, I'm not upset about the anniversary dinner. The calmness in my voice surprised even me. I'm grateful for it. It gave me the clarity I needed. Marcus set down his phone with the careful movements of someone trying to defuse a bomb. Emma, you're clearly having some kind of breakdown. Let's call Dr. Coleman, work through this together. We're not working through anything together. I pulled the letter from my purse, the 5-page love letter I'd written for our anniversary, full of hopes and dreams that no longer belonged to me. I wrote this for you last week. I was going to give it to you at dinner. I handed him the envelope, watching as he scanned the first paragraph with the speed-reading skills he'd honed for reviewing contracts. This is beautiful, he said, though his tone suggested he was still searching for the angle that would return his life to its previous comfortable configuration. You see? This is why we belong together. You understand me better than anyone. I understood the person I thought you were. I took the letter back from his hands, walked to the empty fireplace, and fed it to the flames I'd lit that morning for exactly this purpose. But that person was never real, was he? Marcus watched his last connection to my love turn to ash, and something in his expression finally shifted from confusion to the beginning of genuine panic. You can't just leave, we have a life together, we have plans. You have plans, I corrected. You've had the same plan for 3 years, me waiting patiently while you build a life with someone else. That's not, Sophia is the woman you're in love with. The words hung in the air between us, clear and undeniable. The woman whose needs you prioritize over mine, whose crises you solve while ignoring my pain, whose future you consider while dismissing my dreams. Marcus opened his mouth to offer another explanation, another rationalization, another gentle suggestion that I was misunderstanding the situation. But something in my expression, the absolute calm, the complete certainty stopped him. I don't love Sophia, he said finally, the words sounding hollow even to him. Maybe not, I agreed, but you definitely don't love me. The truth of that statement settled between us like a physical presence. Marcus couldn't deny it because denial would require him to examine his actions over the past 3 years, and that examination would reveal a pattern of choices that spoke louder than any words he could offer. Where will you go? He asked, his voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. I told you, Paris. I mean, where will you stay? How will you support yourself? You can't just disappear into a foreign country because you're upset about— I'm not upset, I interrupted, surprised by the lightness in my chest. I'm free. Marcus spent the next hour cycling through the stages of grief with impressive speed. Denial gave way to anger as he accused me of being selfish, impulsive, vindictive. Anger gave way to bargaining as he offered compromises that should have come years too late: couples therapy, a vacation together, even a break from working with Sophia. We can fix this, he insisted, pacing the empty living room like a caged animal. I'll do whatever you need, just don't throw away 5 years over one misunderstanding. This isn't about one misunderstanding, this is about 5 years of them. Depression hit him when he realized that no amount of negotiation was going to return his life to its previous state. He sat on the floor, there was no furniture left, and put his head in his hands. I never meant for things to get so complicated, he said, his voice muffled. I never meant to hurt you. I know, and I did know. Marcus wasn't a monster. He was a man who'd stumbled into an emotional affair and spent 3 years lying to himself about its nature while expecting me to do the same. But intent doesn't erase impact. The acceptance stage arrived when he finally looked up at me and saw someone he didn't recognize, someone who couldn't be manipulated back into the comfortable role of understanding girlfriend. You're really leaving. I already left, I said gently. I left the night you chose to text another woman during our anniversary dinner. This is just making it official. Marcus pulled out his phone, and for a moment I thought he was going to call Sophia to seek comfort from the woman whose needs had consistently outweighed mine. Instead, he stared at the screen with the expression of someone seeing his life clearly for the first time. I've been an idiot. Yes, I agreed. But being an idiot isn't a crime, it's just a choice. Can I call you once you're settled in Paris? The question broke my heart a little, because it revealed that he still didn't understand the finality of what was happening. He was already thinking of this as a temporary separation, a dramatic gesture that would eventually be reversed through patience and persistence. No, Marcus, you can't call me. I left him sitting in the empty house, surrounded by the consequences of his choices, and drove to JFK Airport with nothing but a suitcase and a future that was entirely my own. The Air France flight from New York to Paris took 8 hours and 45 minutes, just long enough for me to fully absorb the magnitude of what I'd done. As Manhattan disappeared beneath the clouds, I felt the last threads of my old life snap cleanly away. I'd expected to feel sad, or scared, or at least uncertain. Instead, I felt something I'd almost forgotten: excitement. Pure, untainted anticipation for a future that held infinite possibilities instead of predetermined disappointments. The apartment I'd rented sight unseen through a contact at the Sorbonne was a one-bedroom on Rue des Écoles, walking distance from the Latin Quarter, and close enough to the major museums that I could build a new professional life around my passion instead of my obligations. Paris in early summer was everything I'd remembered, and more the golden light that had inspired countless artists, the café culture that treated conversation as an art form, the sense that beauty was not a luxury but a necessity of civilized life. I spent my first week walking. Miles and miles through arrondissements that held stories in their stones, past bookshops and galleries and markets that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with art history in the first place. I walked until my feet ached and my phone died, and I'd forgotten what time zone I was supposed to be worried about. My French, rusty from years of disuse, came back gradually. Conversations with shopkeepers, interactions with neighbors, the simple pleasure of thinking in a language that held no associations with Marcus or Sophia or the compromised person I'd been in their orbit. The position at the Musée Rodin materialized more quickly than I dared hope. Dr. Françoise Moreau, the curator I'd worked with during my graduate program, remembered my thesis on 19th-century bronze casting techniques and had a project perfectly suited to my expertise. "We are preparing a major exhibition on Rodin's contemporaries," she explained over coffee near the museum. "Your background with metallurgical analysis would be invaluable." The work was challenging, engaging, exactly the kind of scholarly pursuit I dreamed of but never had time for while managing the emotional labor of a dying relationship. I spent my days with bronze sculptures and archival documents, uncovering connections between artists who'd influenced each other across centuries. For the first time in years, I felt intellectually alive. The personal awakening took longer, but it was no less profound. Slowly, carefully, I began to remember who I'd been before I'd learned to shrink myself to fit Marcus's limited vision of our future. I bought art for my apartment not because it matched the decor, but because it moved me. I took evening classes in watercolor painting, discovered I had a decent eye for composition. I learned to cook French cuisine, not to impress anyone, but because the process of creating something beautiful and nourishing felt like a form of meditation. Most importantly, I learned to enjoy my own company again, to sit in cafes with a book and not feel like I was waiting for someone more important to arrive. To attend gallery openings alone and actually see the art instead of monitoring someone else's level of engagement. The first month passed in a blur of administrative tasks and cultural adjustment. The second month brought the beginning of genuine friendships with colleagues and neighbors. By the third month, I'd stopped checking my phone for messages from a man who'd already moved on to his next chapter. It was during the fourth month that I met Philippe. Philippe Dubois appeared in my life the way the best things down unexpectedly, at a moment when I wasn't looking for anything except the pleasure of being exactly where I was. I was sitting at Café de Flore on a Thursday afternoon, reviewing notes for a lecture I was giving at the Sorbonne the following week, when a sudden downpour trapped half of Saint-Germain under the café's green awnings. "Excusez-moi," said a voice in accented English. "Might I share your table until the rain stops? Everywhere else seems to be full." I looked up to see a man in his early 40s, dark hair still damp from the rain, holding a leather messenger bag and wearing the kind of smile that suggested he was genuinely apologetic for the intrusion rather than assuming I'd be delighted by the company. "Of course," I said, gesturing to the empty chair across from me. Philippe, as he introduced himself once the waiter had brought him an espressoise, a translator who specialized in art history texts. He worked with museums and auction houses, turning scholarly French into accessible English for international publications. "And you?" he asked, nodding toward the research materials spread across my side of the small table. "I'm working on an exhibition at the Musée Rodin, 19th-century sculptors, and their influence on modern artistic movements." His face lit up with genuine interest, not the polite attention Marcus had shown when I discussed my work, but actual curiosity about the ideas I was exploring. That sounds fascinating. Are you including any of the lesser-known contemporaries? I just finished translating a biography of Camille Claudel that revealed some extraordinary connections to artists who've been completely overlooked by traditional scholarship. For the next 2 hours, as the rain continued and the cafe filled with the comfortable murmur of Parisians waiting out the weather, Philippe and I talked about art with the kind of passionate intensity I'd almost forgotten was possible. He understood the nuances of artistic influence, the way creative ideas travel across generations, the importance of recognizing voices that have been marginalized by history. More than that, he listened. Really listened, asked follow-up questions, built on my ideas instead of waiting for his turn to speak. When the rain finally stopped and the afternoon light began slanting through the cafe windows, I realized I'd spent the most intellectually stimulating afternoon I'd had in years. "I should let you get back to your work," Philippe said, gathering his things with what seemed like genuine reluctance. "Actually," I heard myself say, "I was about to call it a day. Would you like to get dinner? I know a place near the Pantheon that has excellent cassoulet." The invitation surprised me as much as it seemed to delight him. Dinner stretched into a walk along the Seine, which stretched into drinks at a small bar in the Marais, which stretched into the kind of conversation that makes you forget time exists. Philippe was divorced. He told me an amicable split from a woman who decided she preferred London to Paris and consulting to translation. "It was the right decision for both of us," he said without bitterness. "Sometimes people grow in different directions, and the kind thing is to acknowledge that rather than forcing a connection that no longer serves anyone." I thought of Marcus, probably still trying to understand why I'd disappeared from his life so completely, and felt a flutter of recognition. Philippe understood something about relationships that had taken me years to learn. We talked about books, travel, the particular magic of Paris in summer. Philippe had spent a year in New York early in his career, and had loved the energy but missed the cafe culture, the way Parisians treated leisure as essential rather than indulgent. "Americans work to live," he observed, "but sometimes it seems like they forget the living part." It was nearly midnight when he walked me home to Rue des Écoles, and 2 a.m. when we finally said goodnight outside my building. "Would you like to have dinner again tomorrow?" he asked, his manner polite but hopeful. "I'd like that very much." The relationship that developed between Philippe and me was everything my connection with Marcus had never been: easy, balanced, built on mutual respect rather than exhausting negotiation. Philippe brought me flowers not because he'd forgotten an important date, but because he'd passed a market stall and thought the peonies matched my eyes. He remembered that I was nervous about my first lecture at the Sorbonne and sent me a text that morning with a quote from Rodin: "The artist must create a spark before he can make a fire." He cooked elaborate meals on Sunday afternoons, not to impress me, but because he found the process meditative and loved sharing the results with someone who appreciated the effort. Most importantly, he saw me, not as a supporting character in his own story, but as the protagonist of a life worth knowing about. "Tell me about this piece," he'd say when we visited galleries together, genuinely curious about my interpretation rather than waiting to offer his own. "What made you choose conservation?" he asked during one of our long walks through Père Lachaise, and then listened to my answer with a kind of attention that made me feel like my choices mattered. The contrast with my previous relationship was so stark it was almost comical. Where Marcus had made me feel needy for wanting basic consideration, Philippe made me feel cherished for existing. Where Marcus had treated my interests as charming hobbies that shouldn't interfere with his important work, Philippe saw my expertise as something valuable that enriched both our lives. "You light up when you talk about art?" he told me one evening as we sat on my tiny balcony, sharing a bottle of wine and watching the sun set over the Quartier Latin. "It's beautiful to see someone so passionate about their work." 6 months into our relationship, Philippe invited me to meet his daughter Celeste, a precocious 12-year-old who spent alternate weekends with him. I'd been nervous about the introduction, remembering Marcus's obvious relief that his relationship with me had never progressed to the point where children were involved. "She'll either love you or be completely indifferent," Philippe had warned me with a smile. "There's no middle ground with Celeste." Celeste, as it turned out, was a budding artist herself, fascinated by the restoration techniques I used at the museum. She peppered me with questions about how to remove centuries of varnish without damaging underlying paint, whether you could really tell a forgery from an original just by looking at it, why some colors lasted longer than others. You know so much, she said admiringly, bent over the art books Philippe and I had brought to keep her entertained. Do you think you could teach me to paint like this? I spent the afternoon showing her basic watercolor techniques while Philippe prepared lunch, and by evening she'd declared me much more interesting than Papa's last girlfriend, who only wanted to talk about her stupid job at the bank. I think you're approved, Philippe murmured that night as we cleaned up the art supplies Celeste had scattered across his living room. She's wonderful, I said, and meant it. You're lucky to have her. We're lucky to have you, he replied, and something in his tone made me look up from the paint-stained brushes I was rinsing. The love in his expression was clear and uncomplicated, free of the conditional clauses and unspoken reservations that had characterized every tender moment with Marcus. I love you too, I said, realizing it was the first time I'd spoken those words without calculating their strategic impact or worrying about the response they'd provoke. Philippe kissed me then, soft and sure, and I thought about how easy it was to love someone who actually wanted to be loved by you. Marcus found me, inevitably, through the digital breadcrumbs I'd been too focused on my new life to completely erase. A LinkedIn connection from a former colleague led him to my current position at the Musée Rodin, which led him to the museum's website, which featured my photo in a press release about the upcoming exhibition. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning in November, 6 months after I'd left New York, just as I was settling into my office with coffee and croissants from the boulangerie around the corner. Subject: I've been thinking about you. Emma. I know you asked me not to contact you, but I couldn't let another day pass without telling you how sorry I am. You were right about everything about Sophia, about my priorities, about the way I took you for granted. I've been seeing a therapist, Dr. Rodriguez, much better than Dr. Coleman, and I'm finally understanding how badly I hurt you. Sophia and I did have feelings for each other. I can admit that now. We never acted on them physically while you and I were together, but I can see how that doesn't matter. I was emotionally unfaithful, and you deserved so much better. The good news is that Sophia took a position with a firm in London. We're not in contact anymore, and I'm doing the work to understand why I sabotaged the best relationship I've ever had. I miss you every day. I miss your laugh, your passion for your work, the way you made our house feel like home. I miss the future we planned together. I know I have no right to ask this, but would you consider talking to me? I'm willing to come to Paris, to do whatever it takes to show you that I've changed. I love you, Emma. I think I always have, but I was too stupid and scared to protect what we had. Please give me a chance to make this right. All my love, Marcus. I read the email twice, waiting for some echo of the old pain, the familiar flutter of hope that had kept me trapped in an unsustainable situation for so long. Instead, I felt nothing. Not anger, not satisfaction, not even pity. Just the mild detachment of someone reading about a problem that belonged to someone else. The woman who had loved Marcus Whitfield, who had tolerated his neglect, and convinced herself that understanding was the same as being valued, no longer existed. She'd been replaced by someone who woke up every morning excited about her work, who spent evenings discussing art and philosophy with a man who saw her as a treasure rather than an obligation, who'd remembered what it felt like to be chosen every day instead of just endured. I deleted the email without responding. 2 days later, another email arrived. Subject: Please read this. Emma. I realize you might not have seen my last email, or maybe you need more time to process everything. I understand that. I hurt you deeply, and trust takes time to rebuild. I wanted you to know that I've made some big changes. I left the investment firm I couldn't stay somewhere that reminded me of all my mistakes. I'm starting my own practice, focusing on sustainable energy projects. It's something you always said I should do, and you were right. I also wanted you to know that I kept all your things from the house. Everything you left behind. I have it all in storage, waiting for you to come home. I know you're angry, and you have every right to be, but please don't throw away 5 years over my stupidity. We can work through this. We can build something even better than what we had before. I'm including my flight confirmation for this weekend. I'll be in Paris Saturday through Monday, staying at the Hôtel des Grands Boulevards. I'm not going to ambush you at work or show up at your apartment. I'm not that far gone, but if you change your mind, if there's any part of you that thinks we deserve another chance, I'll be waiting. Forever yours, Marcus. This email sparked a flicker of irritation not at his words, but at his presumption. The assumption that my new life was just an extended tantrum, that his transformation, conveniently timed to coincide with Sophia's departure, erased years of systematic neglect, that love was something that could be won back through persistence rather than earned through consistent action. But even the irritation faded quickly, replaced by something much more powerful, pity, not for myself, but for Marcus. He was still trying to solve the wrong problem, still convinced that the right combination of words and gestures could resurrect something that had never been alive in the first place. I showed Philippe the emails over dinner that night, not because I needed advice, but because transparency felt like the foundation of everything good in my current life. "He's coming to Paris," Philippe observed, reading over the messages with the same calm attention he brought to everything. "Apparently. How do you feel about that?" I considered the question seriously, taking inventory of my emotional state the way I might examine a painting for signs of damage. "Nothing, mostly. Maybe a little curious about whether he's actually changed, or if this is just another performance designed to get what he wants." Philippe nodded thoughtfully. "And what do you want to do?" "Nothing," I said, surprised by how certain I sounded. "I want to do absolutely nothing. Let him come to Paris. Let him sit in his hotel room waiting for a call that isn't coming. Let him experience what it feels like to be ignored by someone whose attention he took for granted." "That seems reasonable," Philippe said, reaching across the table to touch my hand. "But are you sure you don't want closure? A chance to tell him how you feel now?" I thought about it, the fantasy of facing Marcus as the woman I'd become, confident and fulfilled and utterly beyond his reach. There was a certain appeal to the idea of letting him see what he'd lost, of demonstrating the life I'd built without him. But then I looked at Philippe, at his kind eyes and patient smile, at the way he asked questions because he genuinely wanted to understand my perspective rather than find ammunition for his own position. "You know what would give me closure?" I said, pretending he doesn't exist, living my life so fully and completely that his presence in this city doesn't register as significant enough to acknowledge. Philippe smiled, the kind of expression that somehow conveyed both admiration and complete understanding. "In that case," he said, "what would you like to do this weekend? I was thinking we could take Celeste to the new exhibition at the Pompidou. She's been asking about contemporary sculpture techniques." "That sounds perfect," I said, and meant it. Saturday arrived gray and drizzly, the kind of weather that makes Paris feel intimate and mysterious. Philippe and I spent the morning at the Marché des Enfants Rouges, selecting ingredients for the elaborate lunch he'd promised to cook for Celeste, who was arriving that afternoon for her weekend visit. I found myself genuinely excited about the prospect of teaching her more advanced watercolor techniques, of sharing my knowledge with someone who approached art with uncomplicated enthusiasm. It occurred to me that this was what family was supposed to feel like, not the exhausting negotiation I'd experienced with Marcus, but the easy pleasure of spending time with people who actively chose your company. We were walking home through the Marais, arms full of market vegetables and fresh bread, when I saw him. Marcus stood outside Café de Floreth, same cafe where I'd met Philippe, looking exactly like what he was, an American tourist trying too hard to blend in with Parisian sophistication. He wore the kind of expensive casual outfit that screamed, "I researched French fashion online," and he was scanning the faces of passing women with the barely concealed desperation of someone looking for a specific person in a city of millions. I stopped walking, not out of shock or distress, but out of genuine curiosity. After 6 months of building a life that had nothing to do with him, Marcus looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, he was still tall and handsome in the conventional way that had once impressed me, but diminished somehow, like a photograph that had lost its color over time. "Is that him?" Philippe asked quietly, following my gaze. "That's him." We stood there for perhaps 30 seconds, watching Marcus check his phone, scan the crowd, check his phone again. He looked lost in a way that had nothing to do with geography, and everything to do with the dawning realization that grand gestures don't work when the other person has genuinely moved on. "He looks lonely," Philippe observed without judgment. "He is lonely," I agreed. "He's been lonely for years, even when we were together. He just thought Sophia would fix that." Marcus's phone buzzed, and I watched him read what was presumably a text message. His face fell in a way that suggested disappointment. Maybe Sophia hadn't been as impressed by his romantic gesture as he'd hoped. Maybe she'd made it clear that his problems weren't hers to solve anymore. "Should we go?" Philippe asked gently. I took one last look at the man I'd once planned to marry, sitting alone at a cafe table in a city that held no meaning for him, waiting for a woman who had grown beyond his ability to understand or deserve. "Yes," I said. "Let's go home." We walked away without Marcus noticing us, and I felt the final thread of connection to my old life snap cleanly in two. Sunday evening brought the confrontation I'd been avoiding, though not in the way I'd expected. Philippe, Celeste, and I had spent a perfect day at the Musée d'Orsay, where I'd given them an impromptu private tour of the Impressionist collection. Celeste had been enchanted by Renoir's use of light, and Philippe had asked thoughtful questions about the relationship between artistic technique and emotional impact. We were walking home through the Latin Quarter, tired and happy and filled with the kind of cultural satisfaction that comes from spending time with art that moves you, when Marcus appeared on Rue des Écoles, like a ghost from a life I'd almost forgotten. "Emma!" The sound of my name in his voice stopped me mid-stride, not because it stirred old feelings, but because it seemed to belong to a completely different universe than the one I currently inhabited. Philippe immediately stepped closer to me, not possessively but protectively, while Celeste looked between the adults with the sharp intuition of a child who senses drama but doesn't understand its source. "Marcus." I kept my voice neutral, polite, the tone I might use with a former colleague I'd run into unexpectedly. "I didn't expect to see you here." He looked terrible, not physically ill, but emotionally wrung out in a way that suggested he'd spent the weekend confronting realities he'd been avoiding for months. "You look," he started, then stopped, taking in my appearance with obvious confusion. I knew what he was seeing, a woman who looked genuinely happy, stylishly dressed in clothes that reflected personal taste rather than a desire to please someone else, standing next to a man who regarded her with obvious affection and a child who was holding her hand with unself-conscious trust. "You look like you," he finished quietly. "This is Philippe," I said, introducing the two men with the casual politeness of someone who felt no obligation to manage anyone's discomfort. "And this is Celeste, Philippe's daughter." Philippe extended his hand with the kind of old-world courtesy that came naturally to him. "Marcus, I presume. Emma has mentioned you." The lie was gentle and kind, designed to give Marcus dignity rather than highlight his irrelevance to my current life. "And you're?" Marcus struggled visibly with the situation, clearly unprepared for the reality of seeing me happy with someone else. "I'm the man who loves Emma," Philippe said simply, "and who is loved by her in return." The words hung in the air like a benediction, clear and uncomplicated and completely true. Marcus looked at me then with an expression I'd never seen before, not the entitled confusion of someone whose possession had malfunctioned, but the genuine grief of someone who'd finally understood what he'd lost. "I came here to win you back," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know. I thought if I could just explain, if I could show you how I've changed." "Marcus," I stopped him gently, the way you might interrupt a child who's telling a story that's going nowhere. "I need you to listen to me very carefully. This isn't about Sophia. It's not about the anniversary dinner or the therapy or any of the specific things you think you need to apologize for." He nodded eagerly, as if preparing to take notes on how to solve the problem of my absence from his life. "This is about the fact that you never loved me enough to choose me when it mattered, and I finally learned to love myself enough to stop waiting for you to." The truth of that statement settled between us with the weight of something that couldn't be argued or negotiated away. "But I did love you," he protested, desperation creeping into his voice. "I do love you." "No," I said, not unkindly. "You loved the idea of me. You loved having someone who would accommodate your choices without requiring you to examine them. You loved the comfort of knowing I'd be there when you were ready to pay attention to me." Philippe squeezed my hand gently, not to interrupt, but to remind me that I wasn't alone in this conversation. "But that's not love, Marcus. That's convenience." Marcus looked at Philippe, then at Celeste, then back at me, as if trying to decode a puzzle that had suddenly become much more complex than he'd anticipated. "And this is love?" he asked, gesturing at the three of us with something that might have been accusation in another context, but sounded more like wonder. "Yes," I said simply. "This is what it looks like when someone chooses you every day, when your happiness matters as much as their own, when your dreams are considered as important as their plans. Marcus's face crumpled then, not with the performative emotion he'd used to manipulate my sympathy during our relationship, but with the raw grief of someone who'd finally understood the magnitude of his loss. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "God, Emma, I'm so sorry." "I know you are," I said gently, "and I forgive you. Not because what you did was okay, but because carrying anger toward you hurts me more than it hurts you." He nodded, tears streaming down his face in a way that suggested he was mourning not just our relationship, but the person he'd been within it. Is there anything I can do? Anything at all? I thought about it seriously, looking at this man who'd once held such power over my happiness and now seemed smaller than the pigeons pecking at crumbs around our feet. "Be better," I said finally. "For the next woman, for yourself, for everyone whose life you touch, learn to love someone more than you love being comfortable." Marcus nodded again, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand like a child. "Will you be happy?" he asked. "Here, I mean. With him." I looked at Philippe, whose patient kindness had never wavered even in this difficult moment, then at Celeste, who was studying a street artist's chalk drawings with the focused attention of someone who understood beauty when she saw it. "I already am," I said. Marcus walked away then, back toward whatever hotel he'd booked for his failed romantic gesture, and I felt the last phantom pain of our connection disappear like morning mist in sunlight. "That was hard," Philippe said quietly, putting his arm around my shoulders. "No," I said, surprising myself with the truth of it. "It was easy. Finally, after all these years, it was easy." Celeste looked up from the street art she'd been studying. "Papa, can we get ice cream?" That conversation made me sad, even though I don't understand why. Philippe laughed, ruffling her hair with the kind of casual affection that spoke to years of practice at being a father. "Ice cream sounds perfect," he said. "Emma, what do you think?" I thought about how simple the question was, how it assumed I had preferences that mattered, how the answer would actually influence what we did next. "I think," I said, "that ice cream sounds like exactly what we need." We walked toward the glacier on Rue Saint-Jacques, three people who'd chosen each other and been chosen in return, and I felt the profound contentment that comes from finally being exactly where you belong. 6 months later, the invitation arrived on cream-colored paper, embossed with elegant script that managed to convey both formality and warmth. Dr. Emma Richardson, curator of European Sculpture Musée Rodin, requests the pleasure of your company at the opening reception for Connections Across Centuries, The Hidden Influence of 19th Century Sculptors. Saturday, June 15th, 7:00 p.m., Musée Rodin. It was my exhibition 18 months of research, writing, and careful curation that had resulted in the most comprehensive exploration of artistic influence across the 19th and early 20th centuries that the museum had ever mounted. The reviews in Art Forum and Apollo had been stellar, and advance ticket sales suggested it would be one of the summer's most attended exhibitions. More importantly, it was work that mattered to me, scholarship that advanced our understanding of how artistic ideas travel across generations and geographic boundaries. It was the kind of project I dreamed of leading when I was a graduate student, the kind of contribution to my field that justified all the years of studying and training and believing that art could change how people see the world. Philippe adjusted my necklace, a delicate gold chain he'd given me for my birthday, inscribed with a line from Rilke, "The only journey is the one within," and smiled at my reflection in the mirror. "Nervous?" he asked. "Excited," I corrected, because nervous implied fear and I felt only anticipation. The opening reception was everything I'd hoped it would be. Colleagues from across Europe, collectors who'd loaned pieces for the exhibition, students and art lovers who'd come to see months of careful work translated into public experience. Dr. Moreau introduced me to the crowd with words that made my chest swell with pride. "Dr. Richardson has given us a gift, a new way of understanding how artists speak to each other across centuries, how influence travels through time in ways we're only beginning to comprehend." I spoke about the exhibition's central thesis, that artistic innovation isn't a series of isolated breakthroughs, but an ongoing conversation between creators separated by decades or even centuries. I talked about the bronze casting techniques that connected Rodin to Renaissance masters, the way Impressionist theories of light influenced sculptors who worked primarily in stone. But mostly, I talked about the joy of discovery, the thrill of finding connections that had been hiding in plain sight for generations. After my remarks, as guests wandered through the galleries and I answered questions about specific pieces, I caught sight of a familiar figure near the museum's garden entrance. Marcus stood just outside the main reception area, not trying to approach but simply watching the celebration of my professional achievement. He looked older than when I'd seen him in November, weathered in a way that suggested he'd spent the intervening months doing the difficult work of examining his life with uncomfortable honesty. Our eyes met across the crowded gallery, and he raised his hand in a small gesture that managed to convey congratulations, apology, and farewell all at once. I nodded in acknowledgement, a simple recognition of his presence that held no invitation for further contact. He smiled then, not the manipulative charm he'd wielded during our relationship, but something sadder and more genuine, and walked away into the Paris evening. I felt nothing but a brief flutter of gratitude that he'd taken the time to witness my success, to see what my life had become in his absence. "Who was that?" Philippe asked, appearing at my elbow with 2 glasses of champagne. "Someone I used to know," I said, accepting the champagne and taking his free hand in mine. "No one important." Philippe kissed my temple, a gesture so natural and affectionate that several guests smiled at the obvious love between us. "How does it feel?" he asked, gesturing at the exhibition, the crowd, the tangible evidence of dreams transformed into reality. I looked around at the galleries filled with sculptures I'd spent months studying, at the carefully crafted wall text that explained connections I'd discovered, at the faces of people engaging with art in ways that might change how they saw the world. This was what I'd always wanted. Not just professional success, but work that mattered, love that nourished rather than depleted me, a life built around my own values rather than someone else's expectations. "It feels like coming home," I said, surprising myself with the accuracy of those words. Philippe raised his champagne glass in a toast. "To Emma Richardson, who taught me that the most beautiful art is a life lived authentically." I clinked my glass against his, listening to the clear ring of crystal meeting crystal, and felt the deep satisfaction that comes from finally being exactly who you were meant to be. Outside, Paris glittered in the summer twilight, full of possibilities I was just beginning to explore. Inside, surrounded by art and friends and the man who loved me enough to let me become myself, I was already home. The exhibition ran for 6 months and broke attendance records. But more importantly, it established me as a scholar whose work mattered, whose insights contributed meaningfully to our understanding of artistic legacy and influence. 6 months after that, Philippe proposed during a weekend trip to Provence. Presenting me with a ring, he designed himself a simple band set with a small diamond surrounded by tiny garnets that matched the burgundy of my favorite wine. "I love you exactly as you are," he said, kneeling in a field of lavender that stretched toward mountains that had inspired painters for centuries. "But I also love who you're becoming, who you'll be in 5 years, in 20 years. I want to choose you every day for the rest of our lives." I said yes, of course, because loving Philippe was the easiest thing I'd ever done. We married the following spring in a small ceremony at the Musée Rodin, surrounded by the sculptures that had brought us together and the friends who'd become our chosen family. Celeste served as our witness, wearing a dress she'd designed herself and painted with watercolors I'd taught her to use. The woman who'd once sat in an empty house in Westchester, waiting for a man who would never choose her, felt like a character from a story I'd once read but could barely remember. In her place stood someone I was proud to be, Dr. Emma Richardson, curator and scholar, wife to a man who saw her as a treasure rather than an obligation, stepmother to a brilliant girl who called her Belle Maman and meant it with her whole heart. I'd learned, finally, the difference between being loved and being chosen. I'd learned that the right person doesn't make you smaller to fit their vision of who you should be, but celebrates the fullness of who you already are. Most importantly, I'd learned that sometimes the greatest act of love is loving yourself enough to walk away from someone who can't see your worth and toward a life that honors everything you were meant to become. Marcus had given me one final gift in losing me, the crystal clear understanding that I deserved better than scraps of attention from someone who saw me as optional. And in learning to value myself, I discovered that I was exactly as worthy of real love as I'd always hoped I might be. The exhibition catalog from Connections Across Centuries sits on my desk as I write this. Next to photographs from our wedding and a drawing, Celeste made of our family 3 people who chose each other and continue choosing each other every single day. It's a small thing, perhaps. This story of a woman who finally learned to leave, but small revolutions can change everything, can transform a life spent waiting into a life spent living. I chose myself, finally and completely. And in doing so, I found everything I'd ever wanted and several things I'd never dared to dream were possible.